Unlimited spa access from now on. How could John keep this a secret? That's just evil. I won't forgive this. It seems that, without my knowledge, my in-laws' place had turned into a luxury hotel. Now I can enjoy the spa every day and eat delicious meals. Just kidding. To think they would use my precious son for their own desires, they've got some nerve. They'd better be ready. My name is Amy. I'm a 35-year-old office worker. I work in the administrative department of a pharmacy. I live with my husband John and our first-grade son Edward. John and I met through a colleague at work. From the moment we first met, John and I just clicked. We quickly became close. It wasn't long before we started dating, and we were married the following year. With my upbeat husband John and lively son Edward, I was leading a life of ordinary happiness. There's another thing that makes me glad I married John. It's having his mother-in-law, Linda, in our lives. Having lost my mother early, I was raised by my father. Linda, who I barely knew as a mother figure, treated me like her own daughter since the start of our marriage. Amy, do you have any plans this Sunday? Why don't you and Edward come over for dinner? She would say, always treating us to delicious meals. When Edward was younger, she was a great support for my parenting struggles. She even helped pick up Edward from daycare when I couldn't leave work. Edward grew very attached to her. Spending Christmas at my in-laws had become a tradition for our family, including Linda. Amy, your mother-in-law really is the best, isn't she? My colleague Emma always listens with an envious look. Actually, it was Emma who introduced me to John. They have been friends since college. Emma, with her bright personality, has many friends. We joined the company together and are close enough to share work frustrations, family matters, and personal issues. The pharmacists and other staff are kind, and the company has excellent benefits. Emma, other colleagues, and I, all with children, continue to work as full-time employees, just as before our pregnancies. I think it's a really great company. Recently, John's been saying he has to work on weekends and isn't home even on his days off. I say, sounding a bit discontented. Are you suspecting him of cheating? John? Cheating? That's laughable. Emma laughs, but it's true that John has been away from home more often. Dad, are you working again today? Edward asks, wanting to play with John. I have to work, sorry, okay? Amy, I'm sorry too. John says, looking apologetic. I couldn't say anything back, feeling proud of John for working hard for our family. Little did I know back then that such dedication would turn into such a terrible betrayal. Working on weekends, rock, paper, scissors. Ugh, the worst. My workplace is usually closed on Sundays and holidays. However, about once a month, we are on duty for the hospital at our gate on Sundays. Accordingly, our pharmacy also opens. It seems that Christmas is our turn this time, and we all played rock, paper, scissors to decide who would work. Unfortunately, I lost. I wanted to spend Christmas at my in-laws. But no choice, I have to do my best. Once Edward started elementary school, I couldn't escape from the PTA, and unfortunately, I lost in rock, paper, scissors again and ended up as an officer. Really, this is just too much. I muttered to myself, only to be chuckled at by the friend sitting next to me. It's not funny, I said to her. She laughed and apologized, saying sorry. This woman is also an officer, and we met at the daycare. Her son Henry and Edward are very close, and our families have become friends. We used to go on trips together, though we've been too busy lately. Her husband Tom is also a kind and gentle person. Her name is Isabella. I call her Henry's mom or Isabella. By the way, Isabella, thanks for playing with Edward in the park last Sunday when I had to work. When I had to work on weekends, John would take care of Edward. Today I played with Henry in the park, Edward told me. When I asked John about it, he said that he ran into Henry and his parents at the park by chance and played together. Really? I asked John, but his vague response frustrated me. By the way, Linda called and said she's looking forward to Christmas. I can't make it, but have fun. I can't go because of work, so it looks like Christmas will be without me this year. Linda sounded very disappointed when I told her I couldn't come. But maybe I'll put John to work and have him do a thorough house cleaning. It's been a while, she said, sounding quite excited about the idea. Feel free to use him as much as you like. I laughed as I talked with Linda. It was close to Christmas when this happened. I was working a late shift that day and had to do some unexpected overtime, so I hurriedly tried to contact John, but couldn't reach him. I ended up calling my son's mobile phone. Mom, are you done with work? Edward answered the phone with a cheerful voice, happy to hear from me. Sorry, Edward. Mom is working late. Can you put Dad on the phone? But Edward said John wasn't there. Wondering where they could be. Hello, Amy? It must be tough working so late. John called and said he's going to be late because of work, Linda said. She told me that while she was preparing dinner at her house, John called her. Sorry, Mom. Amy's on a late shift, and I should get home early, but I have to work overtime. Please help. After saying that, John hung up and couldn't be reached again. I was furious with John's actions. He hadn't contacted me at all, thinking maybe he wouldn't get caught. I rushed home. John still hadn't returned, and at the dinner table were Linda and Edward eating. Linda said she was happy to have dinner alone with her grandson, even though I apologized. I really respect Linda. John came home late that night. Hey, about work. You promised to take care of things when I have a late shift. Can you at least keep that promise? I said quietly. What can I do? It's work. John raised his voice and even suggested that I quit my job or become a part-timer. When John met me, he praised me for working in healthcare. That John, who said such nice things, is no longer here. Our current lifestyle is also thanks to my income. Even though I'm an equal partner to John, he's been doing less housework and recently hasn't been taking care of Edward either. And this guy, probably. Hey, you're not cheating, are you? I looked at John with cold eyes. There's no way. You're overthinking, Amy. He suddenly changed his tone and put his arm around my shoulder. That said it all. John has always tried to appease me like this when he's lying or feeling guilty. How dare he cheat? He better be prepared. I was glad Edward was asleep. I didn't want to show our son such an ugly fight. From then on, we acted normal in front of Edward, but when it was just the two of us, we hardly talked or even made eye contact. When I told my colleague Emma about what happened, that guy is the worst. Let me know if you need anything. That's a cool thing to say. Days passed, and before I knew it, it was Christmas Eve. Take good care of Edward, will you? Say hello to Linda for me. I said that to John, but as usual, he didn't even meet my eyes. I'm off, then. With an indifferent reply, John and Edward left for my in-laws' house. What's with that attitude? It's so annoying. I spent a lonely Christmas Eve alone in our eerily quiet house. There was no contact from John, but thinking he was having a good time with Linda gave me a little peace of mind. I remembered Linda saying she'd make John clean the house. I wondered if he was being worn out by chores and couldn't help but feel a bit of schadenfreude. But little did I know, John was doing something unthinkable at that time. Christmas Day was busy with quite a few patients. Fortunately, I didn't have to work overtime, so I left work and went straight home. I planned to join my in-laws the next afternoon and spend the holiday with Linda. Might as well enjoy some alone time for a change. As I was thinking this, my mobile phone rang. It was Linda. Thinking it was going to be a complaint about John being lazy, I answered. "Amy, Merry Christmas. You must be tired from working on Christmas." "You did great." Linda didn't sound irritated, just her usual kind self. "Merry Christmas, Linda. I wish I could have spent it with you too. Is Edward just playing games?" When I asked, Linda fell silent. Even after calling Linda's name a few times with no response, I wondered if it was a bad signal. "Amy. John and Edward didn't come here this year. I spent Christmas alone," Linda said. As she spoke, Linda began to sob over the phone. I was in a panic. John and Edward definitely left the house yesterday. Where could they possibly be now? There was a long silence between Linda and me. "I'll head over to your place right now." It's about a 40-minute drive to my in-laws. On the way, my mind was filled with thoughts of Edward. What if they were involved in an accident or some incident? These worries were spinning in my head. When I arrived at my in-laws, Linda was already waiting outside. As soon as she got into my car, "Should we call the police?" I asked. Linda quietly shook her head. As I wondered why, Linda slowly began to speak. "Amy, I'm really sorry about my stupid son. Do you think John is having an affair?" Linda looked at me with teary eyes, and I almost started crying too. "What?" "Actually." That's when I remembered something and hurriedly drove to a certain place. When we reached our destination. "Hello, Edward? Is Dad nearby?" "Yeah, he's here. Come quickly, Mom." I called Edward's mobile phone, and he answered immediately. Even though we had been apart for only a day, Edward's voice sounded so dear to me. "Hello. What is it, Amy?" "I'm busy right now." I heard John's voice, sounding like he wanted to end the call immediately. Hearing that voice made me feel an intense loathing, wanting to confront him. "Linda, you said something about making him clean, right? So, are you at your parents' house now?" John's response on the phone was calm. "Yeah, that's right, Amy. I can't wait to see you." When did he become so adept at lying as easily as breathing? Should I have quit my job? Should I have tried harder at home? But none of that justifies an affair. "Oh. So, Linda, you started a luxury hotel? Does that mean unlimited spa access? How could John keep this a secret? I won't forgive him." I said those last words filled with hatred, in a very low tone. John on the phone seemed quite flustered. To his silence, I said, "Hey, come out of the room. This is the luxury hotel I always wanted to visit. You said it was too expensive, remember?" As I spoke fluently, John seemed to give up. "I'm sorry," he said in a barely audible voice. I found this place using the GPS on Edward's mobile phone. This hotel, not far from my in-laws, was the place I wanted to visit. The fact that John, who said it was too expensive for me, was enjoying himself here with his mistress infuriated me. Perhaps it showed on my face, because on the way to the hotel, Linda kept apologizing. I then found out for the first time that when I worked late shifts, Linda was almost always the one taking care of Edward. I hadn't noticed because she would return home before I got back. John, who is terrible at cooking, used to buy ready-made food, and if Linda tried to cook, he stubbornly refused her. Looking back, that must have been a strategy to keep me from finding out. Even during that short time, John was so enthralled with his mistress. Linda initially believed John was really working, but as his absences increased, her suspicions of an affair naturally grew. The climax was when Linda, asked to take care of Edward as usual, saw John walking arm in arm with an unknown woman, looking intimate. She debated whether to consult me but decided against it. The main reason was, I didn't want to lose the chance to see Amy and Edward. Linda sobbed in the passenger seat. Knowing she cared so much for us, tears streamed down my cheeks too. Linda was more considerate of me and Edward than John ever was. This time, John had contacted her, saying he would spend some rare time alone with Edward, but asked her to cover for him, saying he'd be at her house. Linda, suspecting a lie, worried about Edward and contacted me. I despised John from the bottom of my heart for involving so many people. At the hotel, after explaining the situation, we were made to wait in the lobby. Then, a man and woman with guilty expressions on their faces emerged, along with, Mom. I was getting bored. I played a lot with Henry. Next to Edward was his friend Henry. Henry looked around and said, It looks like my dad hasn't arrived yet. He seemed a bit disappointed. John's mistress was Isabella, a mom from the daycare. I wasn't sure how long the affair had been going on, but these two fools had boldly involved our children. Apparently, they had told their sons that their respective parents would join them later. How despicable. John had booked 2 rooms, one for the children and the other for themselves. So repulsive. Thanks to the hotel's kindness, Linda and I were allowed to stay in a room for a while, where Linda looked after the children in the other room. Isabella, having an affair with my husband and then talking to me normally at the committee meetings. I spoke in a calm tone. What? I thought Amy hadn't noticed anything. It was so funny. Isabella laughed. What is this woman? I never would have guessed that Isabella, who seemed so fragile and beautiful, was actually this spiteful. I stared at her quietly, pondering the unpredictability of people. John himself seemed a bit taken aback by Isabella's true nature. This woman, without being asked, happily began to talk about how and when she started her affair with John. Their relationship began when our children were in senior kindergarten, on a day I was sick and couldn't attend a parents' meeting, so I asked John to go in my place. It was Isabella who had made the first move. We had known each other as families and had each other's contact information. From that day on, they began to communicate more frequently. It started with complaints about their spouses, but gradually turned into personal conversations. Soon, they began meeting more often, and it didn't take long for their relationship to become romantic. But now it's all over. What a pity! Isabella chuckled. To her nonchalant attitude, I said, You seem quite relaxed for someone about to face serious consequences. Ignoring her surprised, eh? I stood up decisively. To my bewildered husband, I said, Come on, get up and check out. I've called a ride for you, so get ready quickly. I smiled slightly and left the room. Seeing Isabella's face twitch a bit from my remark felt satisfying. Now begins the hellish drive. The trip isn't over until we're home. After checking out, as we headed to the parking lot, Dad. Henry ran joyfully towards the person he was waiting for. It was, of course, Henry's dad, Tom, Isabella's husband. Henry. Sorry to keep you waiting. Have you been good? Tom said in his usual calm manner. Dad, can Edward and I go home first? Mom and you need to talk, he said gently, and the 2 boys happily got into my car. Thank you. We'll have a long talk on the way home, I said, glaring at Isabella. I had learned from contacting Tom that he was supposedly at work, and Isabella had lied about visiting her parents far away to come here. Both of them are utterly despicable. I was forced to come here. John threatened to use Edward to ostracize Henry at school if I didn't. Isabella started with a shallow lie. Really? You seemed so eager to tell me everything just a while ago. Let's let Tom hear it too. I placed the voice recorder with our earlier conversation in Tom's hand. As she desperately tried to grab it, I said, don't bother. I have another copy just for myself. Smiling, I got into my car. From behind, John's pathetic voice called. Wait, what am I supposed to do now? John called out to me in a pathetic voice from behind. Go home alone? Oh, but I thought you might feel lonely, so I arranged a ride for you too. What? I said this and pointed behind John as I drove away. Standing behind John were my colleague Emma and her husband, who was also a friend from college. Apparently, John owed him a big favor and couldn't stand up to him. I glanced over and saw they were already scolding him. Emma gave me a look that said, "Leave it to me." Though my husband was a disappointment, I was lucky to have supportive people around me. As I expected, everyone's ride home was hellish. Isabella desperately denied her relationship with John in the car, but no one believed her with the voice recorder playing. She eventually admitted to having other affairs. I don't know if John was serious, but he was the one being played from the start. The reason Isabella targeted John was so petty, because Edward got the lead role in a school play over Henry. I was furious. I planned to make him pay a hefty alimony. Henry's custody went to Tom, of course. He said he was going back to his parents' place, a bit far away. John came home late that night, looking like a ghost. Seems like he got a good scolding from Emma and her husband. John always said his college friends were very important to him, as if it were a mantra from the beginning of our marriage. Now, because of this incident, John probably won't be invited to their gatherings anymore. It's nothing but karma. He brought this upon himself. He should regret it. What angered me the most was that every time he met his mistress, John told Edward, "Today's a secret between us men, okay? Don't tell Mom." That's what he used to say. Edward kept that promise and never told me anything. When I found out, I was moved to tears. John and I successfully finalized our divorce. You stupid man! How can you face your late father now? Don't ever show your face again, Linda said and slapped him. John finally realized the gravity of his actions and cried like a child. But my heart didn't waver. Afterward, John requested a transfer to a branch outside the prefecture. He paid the alimony and is keeping up with child support. As for me and Edward, we're living with Linda at her place. I considered returning to my parents' home, but my father has remarried and has a new family. Living together would be impossible. Linda suggested we stay with her until our lives stabilize. People are often surprised by our unique relationship, but I still cherish Linda like my real mother. I hesitated about what to call her, but I still call her Linda. We're keeping it a secret, but we plan to celebrate her 60th birthday at that hotel. I splurged and booked the most expensive room. This should turn the unpleasant memories into enjoyable ones. My job became far, and Edward had to transfer schools, but Tom's parents live near our former in-laws, so the boys ended up in the same school again. That was a surprise. Once things settle down, I might rent an apartment near work, but for now, I want to cherish this time a little longer. Hey, what are you doing sleeping here? You're not seriously going to make me bring this, are you? Looking over, I found my stepson Zach pointing at the lunch on the table. Zach, who's always particular about his food, checks the contents of the sandwich inside the lunchbox and which snack is packed with the sandwich. Oh, I'm sorry. I've got a fever of 104 degrees. I've been tormented by a high fever since this morning but I stood up, reaching to put the sandwich in the lunchbox. However, Zach roughly brushed the sandwich aside with his hand. Hey, why would you do that? Though I was suffering from the fever, I raised my voice. Then, Zach's face suddenly flushed with anger and started to tremble. He grabbed the vase from the table and threw it at me with all his might. Your dad's parasite, don't you dare slack off at home. As Zach, my husband Ashton's son from his previous marriage, grew up, his attitude towards me worsened. But this was the first time he went this far. I staggered but managed to dodge the vase thrown by Zach. He must have been really upset to be scolded by me. I can't forgive him, but I'm too sick to deal with Zach right now. I feel like I could collapse at any moment because I'm feeling so unwell. Enough is enough. Suddenly, I hear a shout from behind me. It's unmistakably Ashton's voice, and I thought the scolding was directed at me. I had told Ashton about feeling unwell last night. It's too much, just because lunch was only a simple sandwich. When I timidly turn around, there stood Ashton. Looking furious like never before, his shoulders shaking with anger. At Ashton's feet lay the shattered pieces of the vase thrown by Zach, wetting the floor. Zach looks at me with a serves you right expression upon Ashton's entrance. Just as Zach starts to smirk and opens his mouth, an unexpected word comes out of Ashton's mouth. My name is Tracy. I'm a 49-year-old housewife. I married my current husband Ashton when I was 42. It was my first marriage, but for Ashton, this was his second. I met Ashton at my previous job. I was doing clerical work at the company, and Ashton, who frequently visited as a salesman, became an acquaintance. I've always been shy around people, but as I talked with Ashton, who was serious and honest, I was drawn to his character. Ashton had a son from his previous marriage. I was surprised when I learned that such a serious person had been married before. Could it be that even for someone like him, a marriage could fail? That's what I initially thought, but after hearing the details from Ashton, I felt sympathy. Ashton's ex-wife was quite the partier, and the divorce was caused by her infidelity. Even though he knew about her bad habits during their relationship, Ashton believed they would change. However, no matter how hard Ashton tried, the outcome didn't change. Despite saying I won't do it again, his ex-wife cheated repeatedly. Even after their son was born, her bad habits didn't stop, and Ashton finally decided to divorce. He couldn't leave his son with such a mother, a tough decision indeed. Ashton dearly loved the son he had with his ex-wife, who he used to be deeply in love with. The son's name is Zach, and he's now 21 years old, attending college. Though there's no blood relation between me and him, he became my son when I married Ashton. I had been introduced to Zach several times during our dating period. The first time I met Zach, he was 10 years old. Since it was a very sensitive issue, Ashton and I took our time to talk to Zach about it. No matter how much we loved each other, if Zach rejected us, that would be it. Being a primary school student, it was difficult for him to understand everything. To be honest, it didn't seem like it was such an important matter to Zach. Without any rejection, Zach became my son. However, once we started living together, Zach's troubles became apparent. Ashton is a businessman working in sales at a major insurance company. He's serious by nature and has been raising Zach alone since his divorce from his ex-wife. While raising a child, he also managed to do his job well at the company, eventually becoming an executive. Ashton worked hard for Zach's sake, ensuring that Zach could live a life without experiencing any misfortune. But raising a child alone has its limits, even for a father. After work, it often got late, or I ended up leaving Zach alone. Though my parents-in-law lived not too far away, Ashton, being the serious type, didn't like relying too much on them. That inevitably led to him being overly indulgent with Zach. He compensated for not being able to spend much time with him by buying him various things and spoiling him. Seeing this, Zach grew cunning. He knew that by acting good in front of Dad, he could get anything he wanted. He became increasingly adept at committing misdeeds without the adults around him noticing. That was precisely how he was acting when I first met Ashton. For Zach, my presence was nothing but an annoyance. He probably thought that having a new mother figure would take away his freedom. Yet, he didn't oppose our marriage because he saw me as an outlet for his stress. Even as a child, he exploited my delicate position. Before we were married, I was a guest, and Ashton prioritized me. But once married, we were family. Zach understood this too well, knowing that Ashton would put his blood-related son first. Whose words would Ashton believe first, mine or Zach's? Once the three of us started living together, Zach's attitude towards me changed drastically, and the harassment began. I was prepared for some rebellion from a boy in elementary school, but since Dad's feeding you, it's only natural you take care of me, right? What I say goes, so get used to it. The first time Zach said such abusive words to me, I was furious. Those aren't words a child should say to a parent, and it shouldn't be allowed. Zach, do you understand what you just said? Even if it was a joke, there are things you shouldn't say. Think about why Mom is angry. Zach listened to my words with a smirking face. Rather, he seemed to enjoy being scolded. It was eerie to see Zach smirking through my serious scolding. He understood his position as a stepson and how we might be seen by society. Having had little to do with children before, I was appalled by how cunning he was. I never imagined a child could say such things. That night, when Ashton came home, I told him about the incident with Zach. The unnaturally mature behavior, the abusive words towards me. I was nearly in a panic, but made sure to convey everything to Ashton. However, contrary to my feelings, Ashton's thoughts were exactly as Zach predicted. Zach said that to you? No way. Aren't you exaggerating a bit? Zach isn't the kind of child to say such things. Ashton didn't take my report seriously and refused to believe Zach's abusive words. No matter how much I insisted, Ashton's reaction didn't change. On the contrary, he was irritated by my persistence. Tracy just doesn't like Zach because he's not her real son, he implied without saying it outright, but it was apparent in his actions. Let's drop this subject. You used to care so much about Zach before we got married. I'm disappointed in you. Ashton said that inside deeply. I didn't want to hear such words from Ashton. Despite everything, I was seriously engaging with Zach. I no longer thought of him as someone else's child. But from Ashton's perspective, it seemed I was seen that way. Ashton's words crushed me. Saying any more would only worsen our relationship. I felt that and gave up on discussing about Zach any further. Zach, who had been watching secretly, grew confident from the situation. Dad really does believe in me, he concluded with deep conviction. Still, there were times when my patience ran out. If this continued, Zach would grow up to be a terrible adult. I was afraid of ruining my relationship with Ashton, but each time I scolded Zach and consulted Ashton. However, the result was always the same. I even directly asked Zach several times, but he dismissed it. I would never say such a thing to Mom, right? It must be a misunderstanding or you misheard. Maybe Mom just feels that I'm in the way. Zach exploited my position, using it to wedge himself into Ashton's affections. If things continue this way, Zach will keep having his way, and eventually, irreversible cracks will form in my relationship with Ashton. The parental instinct to do what's best for Zach started to be suppressed deep down. I tried to refrain from interfering in Zach's actions as much as possible, and even kept my emotions in check. I didn't want to resort to such thinking, but Zach would eventually leave this home, and I just had to endure until then. Perhaps, in time, his feelings towards me would change, and he might even apologize. In my daily interactions with Zach, I knew the likelihood of that happening was almost nil. However, I had no choice but to keep encouraging myself. And so, I continued to deceive myself, desperately enduring each day. It was around the time Zach was about to graduate from high school. Having been tutored by a top-notch instructor, Zach had secured admission to one of the most competitive universities in the state. Perhaps feeling relieved after securing his admission, he started to act even more arrogantly than before. That day, Ashton was away on a business trip that lasted several days, leaving the house empty. In the evening, after finishing the chores, I waited for Zach's return. With Ashton not around, we were supposed to have dinner together, so I prepared a proper menu as usual. However, Zach didn't return even after his usual time had passed. I hadn't heard anything, but maybe he was delayed by a class or something. Could something have happened? I sent a message to Zach's mobile phone, but there was no reply from him. Even past 8 p.m., with no contact from Zach, I didn't start dinner, waiting for him to return. About an hour later, I heard a noisy group outside the house. Feeling a bad premonition, I opened the front door, and there stood Zach, bringing along several boys and girls. "What? You're home? We're gonna have a party now, so can you leave?" Upon seeing my face, Zach clicked his tongue and said that. From behind, jeers like "When is it gonna start?" and "Hurry up" followed. "Leave! I was making dinner, waiting for you to come home." I threw back at Zach, bewildered. It was unthinkable to allow a party with many university students at this hour. "Like I care! This is my house, so just get out of the way!" Zach yelled, pushing past me to enter the house. Following him, the group of boys and girls also started pouring into the house. Powerless, I could only watch the procession. Soon after, loud music began to play inside, and the students' clamor reached my ears. This would surely disturb the neighbors. I rushed through the students towards Zach, covering my ears. "Turn off the music now!" I shouted, trying not to be drowned out by the music. However, Zach deliberately ignored me, pretending not to hear. Overwhelmed by the students' fervor, I was helpless. I'm not sure how long it had been, but the sound of sirens began to mix with the loud music. Predictably, the sirens belonged to police officers, called by a neighbor's report. As the guardian, I received a stern warning, and Zach and his friends were ordered to disperse. I was just embarrassed and sorry for causing such a nuisance over something so trivial. While Zach had been meek in front of the officers, he started complaining to me once everyone had left. "Who called the cops? Seriously, so annoying." The next day, when Ashton returned from his trip, I reported the incident and asked him to talk to Zach. "You're not a child anymore. Act with the awareness of an adult and live without shame." Zach apologized to me sincerely after being lectured by Ashton. Later, Zach and Ashton went to apologize to the neighbors together. After receiving a good scolding from the neighbors, Zach returned home with tears in his eyes, seemingly having learned his lesson. I thought Zach had truly reflected and changed, but my hopes were soon dashed. One night, sometime after Zach started university, I was suddenly hit by a chill and measured my temperature with the thermometer. I had a slight fever. Although I had no symptoms of a cold, my body felt sluggish and my head wasn't clear. I told Ashton I would go to bed early, just to be safe, and went to sleep. The next morning, the alarm clock went off at 5 a.m. as usual so I could prepare Zach's lunch. Upon waking, I was hit by a severe headache, barely able to lift myself up. Somehow managing to get out of bed, I checked my temperature. 104 degrees, this was definitely bad. However, I felt I still had to prepare Zach's lunch. Clinging to tables and walls, I barely made it to the kitchen. In this condition, it was impossible to cook properly. Normally, I make everything from scratch, including sandwiches along with homemade scones and muffins. I usually pack some fruits as well. But today, I decided to just make a simple sandwich with some vegetables to keep the nutritional balance in mind. Despite the high fever, I desperately finished making Zach's lunch. Maybe it was the relief of finishing the lunch, but I fell asleep for a moment in the dining chair, only to be awakened by Zach's voice. "Hey, what are you doing sleeping here? You're not seriously going to make me bring this, are you?" Looking up, Zach was pointing at the sandwich on the table. Zach, who's always particular about his food, checks the contents of the sandwich inside the lunchbox and which snack is packed with the sandwich. "Oh, I'm sorry. I've got a fever of 104 degrees. I stood up, reaching to put the sandwich into the lunchbox. However, Zach roughly brushed off the sandwich on the table aside with his hand. "Hey, why would you do that?" Even with the fever, I raised my voice. Then, Zach's face suddenly turned red, and his body began to shake with anger. He grabbed a vase from the table and threw it at me with all his might. "Don't slack off on housework. You're nothing but Dad's parasite." I staggered but managed to dodge the vase thrown by Zach. He must have been really upset to be scolded by me. I can't forgive him, but I'm too ill to deal with Zach right now. I feel like I could collapse at any moment because I'm feeling so unwell. "Enough is enough!" Suddenly, I hear a shout from behind me. It was undoubtedly Ashton's voice, and I thought the scolding was directed at me. I had told Ashton I was feeling unwell last night. This is too much, just because I made a simple lunch. When I timidly turned around, there stood Ashton. Looking furious like never before, his shoulders shaking with anger. At Ashton's feet lay the shattered pieces of the vase thrown by Zach, wetting the floor. Zach looked at me with a serves-you-right expression upon Ashton's entrance. Just as Zach starts to smirk and opens his mouth, Ashton shouted again. "Zach, I'm talking about you!" Zach stopped in his tracks at Ashton's angry voice, unable to comprehend Ashton's reprimand. "Huh? What are you talking about? Dad?" Zach was visibly shaken, his body trembling. Looking as if he might cry, staggering towards me. "You have a fever. Tracy, you should be resting." Ashton, still glaring at Zach, approached me and told me so. Unable to grasp the situation, I too stood frozen, unable to move. Then, Ashton gently placed his hand on my shoulder. "Just leave this to me." I cautiously looked up at Ashton's face and slowly nodded. There was no sign of resentment or anger in his gaze. If anything, his eyes conveyed regret and apology. Supported by Ashton, I managed to sit down on a nearby chair. While I sat down with Ashton's help, Zach, unable to hide his disturbance, was mouthing words as if wanting to say something. "Thank you." After seating me, Ashton began to ignore Zach and started cleaning up the broken vase pieces scattered on the floor. After gathering the shards, he carefully wiped the wet floor and picked up the flowers that were miserably scattered around. The flowers I had bought had their petals scattered from being thrown. Ashton carefully placed a few flowers into a cup filled with water. During this time, Zach was so overwhelmed by the somber atmosphere that he couldn't say anything. He seemed to understand what was coming next. As Ashton turned back to face Zach, his eyes were again filled with fierce anger. "You're no longer a child of this house. Do you understand what you've done to Mom?" Ashton muttered sternly while glaring at Zach. The kitchen fell silent, with Ashton's heavy words echoing. "Wait, Dad, what are you talking about? Stop with the bad jokes. They're not funny." Sensing Ashton's intention, Zach, though panicking, tried to respond jokingly. "Pack your things and leave immediately." Ignoring Zach's remarks, Ashton said this quietly before placing his hand on my shoulder in shock. "Come on, lie down in bed." I nodded silently and then went to the bedroom with Ashton's support. As I lay down, Ashton covered me with a blanket. "I'm sorry for everything up to now. I sensed he was looking down on you, but I never imagined he was acting like that behind my back. Tracy, you kept quiet for his sake, didn't you?" Ashton's voice trembled as he repeated "I'm sorry" several times. "After you rest a bit, we'll go to the hospital." Ashton was visibly shaken and disturbed, but after a while, he said this and left the room. The kind words from Ashton, whom I thought would blame me, filled my heart. It wasn't just Zach he loved, he had been loving me properly as well. Ashton was struggling in his own way, watching over me. Despite the severe fever making my body ache, the pain was forgotten as a glimmer of hope started to shine in my heart. After Ashton took me to the hospital, the diagnosis was a high fever due to overwork. I was told to rest easy for a while, and then I started recuperating at home. When we returned home, Zach was still walking around with a big bag, seemingly in disbelief. He continued packing while watching Ashton, but Ashton didn't even look at Zach. After a while, Zach seemed to give up and left the house. He had become a university student. He could take care of himself, but I never imagined it would come to this. Zach will probably seek refuge with his grandparents or friends and return home once things settled down. Ashton's anger was way past normal. However, he wouldn't abandon his beloved son. I had naively thought so, but Ashton's resolution was far firmer than I imagined. As expected, Zach fled to his grandparents' house. He lied to his grandparents, saying Mom kicked me out, and managed to win their sympathy. Oh my! How terrible! I'll talk to Dad myself, so tell me everything that happened. Zach, thrilled at deceiving his grandparents, planned to use this opportunity to frame me. He started claiming that he had been receiving terrible harassment from me, who was not his real mother, all along. He fabricated a story about throwing the vase in a panic to protect himself during this incident. Dad is misunderstanding, he pleaded with tears, winning his grandparents over to his side. Poor thing! You can skip university today and just rest. Don't worry about Mom, I'll handle her properly. Zach, satisfied that his plan was working, proudly snuggled into the prepared bed. I'll play the role of a grandson who can't recover from the shock. Zach believed this without a doubt. However, Zach was about to face a far worse hell. The next day, Zach wore a smug face as he left for the university, while his grandparents sent him off. He thought this might be his chance to get rid of me, the nuisance. He had been using everyone to his advantage so far, thinking it was about time. Everything seemed to be going according to his plans, but as the lecture started, his belief crumbled with a noise. Zach. I received a notice of withdrawal from the university by your dad yesterday. The instructor, recognizing Zach, said this with a troubled look. The room started buzzing at those words. What? What do you mean? That can't be right. Must be some mistake. With Zach's desperate plea, the instructor said he would check and left the classroom. Zach tried to respond confidently to the gazes from around him. Don't worry, it's gonna be fine. The teacher must have confused me with someone else. Making a fuss over nothing. Yet, a bad premonition ran through Zach's mind. No way, he wouldn't go that far. When the instructor returned, he told Zach straightforward. There's no mistake. Zach, your withdrawal has been processed. With the instructor's words, the room buzzed even more, and Zach was engulfed in despair. Filled with embarrassment, Zach's face turned red, and he dashed out of the classroom. This can't be happening. What's going on? Racing down the long corridor, Zach muttered complaints under his breath. Why dominated his thoughts, slipping out unintentionally. He pulled out his mobile phone to call Ashton. However, Ashton had blocked his calls, leaving Zach unable to connect. Panicked, Zach hurried towards his grandparents' house. Upon arrival, he was greeted by the sight of his bag thrown in front of the entrance. What is this? Zach's panic intensified as he rang the doorbell. Seeing no response, he desperately banged on the front door. Grandma! Grandpa! He pleaded with tears in his voice, but there was no answer from inside. In that moment, Zach realized. He had been betrayed by his grandparents. With nowhere else to go, Zach grabbed his discarded bag and headed home. Hoping for some mistake, but the reality of the situation was clear. Sobbing, Zach rang the doorbell upon his return, and I was there to greet him. What's happening? I was wrong. Please help me. I led in Zach, who was sobbing. And he continued to cry even louder, perhaps feeling relieved. As planned, I took Zach to the room where Ashton was waiting. Zach remained inconsolable in front of Ashton, who watched silently, waiting for the crying to stop. Eventually realizing this, Zach ceased his tears. Once Zach had stopped, Ashton, still stern, finally spoke. What do you intend to do by coming here now? With those words, Zach was filled with despair again. He wasn't forgiven. There was no return to this home. You should know, Grandma and Grandpa won't let you in anymore either. I said, adding insult to injury. The plan had always been to welcome Zach if he fled to them, then to turn him away. This shock was greater than an outright rejection. It was retaliation for Zach, who had pretended to repent but betrayed my trust. He was to experience firsthand what I had endured. There's no plan to revoke your university expulsion. If you want to continue, figure out the tuition yourself. The expulsion was Ashton's decision, not something I had considered. It was to ensure Zach faced the consequences of his actions. Before marrying Tracy, I might have made you feel neglected. That's why I prioritized you over her. You were always good in front of me, and I believed you were repentant for your mistakes. Despite knowing better, Ashton had indulged Zach excessively. Feeling sorry for him losing his mother and trying to compensate. But Zach's continuous disrespect and the vase-throwing incident were the last straw for Ashton. In a way, Ashton blamed his own upbringing for Zach's repulsive character. Unable to forgive the years of suffering Zach had caused me, Ashton had no choice but to believe in the harsh reality. Taking everything from Zach and casting him aside was also a punishment for Ashton himself. So, I can't get help from you anymore? I can't make it on my own. Zach pleaded tearfully, but Ashton's mind was made up. As a small mercy, Ashton handed Zach a month's worth of living expenses. In this limited time, Zach had no choice but to fend for himself. For Zach, who had been coddled and used to getting his way. This was hell. Being expelled from university meant he was off the promised elite path. Cut off from his parents and grandparents, he had to navigate life alone. The grandparents had always doted on Zach, their grandson. But after Ashton revealed Zach's numerous transgressions against me, their perspective shifted. No matter how beloved, some actions are unforgivable. At first, the word disownment seemed to baffle them a bit. But with Ashton's firm resolve and considering Zach's own situation, they cooperated. That very day, Zach rented a room in an old, dingy apartment where he could afford with the little money he had. The bath and toilet were shared, and the room was covered with thin, grimy walls. If he ever made noise with a large group of friends like before, he would be kicked out immediately. Staring at the little money he had left, Zach shed tears. He had lost his home and his family. His friends, who had always enjoyed Zach's generosity, were gone, having only used him. Zach, always unreasonable and lacking common sense, had kept his friends around with money. Now without any support, his future was bleak. He had never worked part-time before, relying on his parents for all his social expenses. Could someone as spoiled as him even manage to work? To survive, he had to find even the most grueling jobs. Thinking about this, Zach couldn't stop the tears from flowing. A year had passed since Zach left our home. Ashton started to put me first again, like when we first met. For about 10 years, everything had revolved around Zach, so we were reclaiming our relationship. I no longer had to ponder over Zach, allowing me to purely enjoy my relationship with Ashton. I'm truly sorry for all the hardship I've caused. I became blinded by my love for my son. I had never voiced it, but whenever Ashton criticized my statements about Zach, I would become physically ill from the stress. Being attacked on the point of having no blood relation felt like exploiting a vulnerability. Legally, he was my son, but that was one aspect I couldn't change. I felt devastated, as if being targeted. Now, Ashton and I can talk about it because Ashton himself always had this sensitive issue in the back of his mind. Not in a bad way, but he had decided never to mention it to me. Knowing how much it troubled me, Ashton began apologizing whenever possible. Zach's departure seemed to have freed us from various entanglements. Whether he knew it or not, Zach started sending letters periodically. They weren't about wanting to mend our relationship, but rather updating us on his situation. Perhaps it was his way of apologizing. Since that day, he has been desperately looking for work, sustaining his days through manual labor. Although Ashton says nothing, he seems somewhat relieved by these letters. We won't reach out anymore, but it's eased our minds. It's difficult for us to have children at our age, but it seems we can live harmoniously as a couple. There were more hardships than happiness, making everyday survival a challenge. But now, I can walk through my life, a bright and joyful one.